Hello, I'm Melanne Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And I also serve on the board of the Atlantic Council. I'm here with Ambassador Roya Rahmani to discuss her new report, Women as the Way Forward, a lesson from Afghan women's empowerment journey. Ambassador Rahmani has over 20 years' experience working with governments, NGOs, and the private sector. Currently, she serves as a distinguished fellow at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security and a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. She was the first woman to serve as Afghanistan's ambassador to the United States, and earlier as Afghanistan's first woman ambassador to Indonesia. As she writes, her entire life in Afghanistan has been shaped by one conflict after another, starting with the Soviet invasion, through the Civil War, and the Taliban's rule in the 1990s. With the overthrow of the Taliban, the revival of democracy and freedom was such a hopeful time, only to be shattered by the Taliban's takeover 2 years ago. Welcome, Ambassador Rahmani. It's so good to see you. I want to start by asking you about your motivation for writing this report. 2 years have passed since the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan, and in many ways, sadly, the world has moved on. What was your goal in writing the report at this time?
Thank you. I'm writing this report right now precisely because 2 years has passed and very little has changed. People are still confused about what to do in Afghanistan. The situation remains dire. The country's economy is in shambles and people are starving. And Afghanistan has turned, to say the least, to a big prison for its women. The international community feels like they can't really do anything, even if they wanted to. In the absence of a coherent policy for Afghanistan, beyond watching for the threats of the terrorism, everyone has simply turned to humanitarian relief support. Over the past 2 years, United States alone has appropriated over $2 billion in the form of humanitarian aid. While aid is very necessary lifeline, this approach perpetuates conditions of dependency without advancing interests of the United States, the international community, and most importantly, the Afghan people. I needed to write this report now because I think enough is enough. From all lessons that we have learned together over the last 2 decades and the past 2 years, we know better to continue to recycle old policies that are not working. Many who have been involved and care want to do something. So I hope that this report would be shedding some light in terms of ways that we can move forward and hopefully be more effective.
Well, let's hope that that's the case, Ambassador Rahmani. And let's talk a little bit about what's in the report. You provide an historical context before you go into what you think should be done now to address these issues. Why was it important for you to begin with an overview of Afghan's history? I know you also wrote that it's been heavily influenced by conflicts over women's rights over all of these decades. Can you explain?
Absolutely. As I alluded before, in the aid and development communities, a lot of policies very often and simply just get recycled. I wanted to give a true account of what has and has not worked in Afghanistan. And hopefully we can be sure of being mindful of those. The reality is, women's rights and role have always been at the center of Afghan politics, both in the formation of the domestic political identities and as an impetus for foreign interventions. I think this history is often overlooked and undermined, when the reality is it's a very key part of the puzzle, especially now that we are navigating a very complex situation. Naturally, a large part of the report is about the sections that is focusing on how the empowerment efforts over the past 20 years worked or did not work. But it's also critical that we look further back and talk a little bit about the lessons from the overthrow of Afghanistan's progressive king, Shah Amanullah, who gave women the right to vote in 1919, to the Taliban emergence and their draconian rules, especially the crackdown on women in 1990s, and their return now again. We need to acknowledge that these debates and power struggles are not new, nor they are really provoked by the Western intervention. Afghan women's empowerment journey is one of the most foundational narratives of Afghan history and forms the basis for the future efforts to rebuild Afghanistan for all its citizens, men and women alike. So, history is really most useful when we are talking about it, when it shed lights and help us understand future or navigate future. So using historical grounding, I look at the current situation, providing a quick overview of the realities of what's happening and what are some of the mistakes that are taking place that prevent us from moving forward as well as we could, or as effective as we could. I also hope that these lessons will be helpful in providing insights as international community navigates other situations, both in conflict places, post-conflict places, and many more. So that is basically the reason that historical context and the way that the women has been incorporated in all of this is a part of the report.
Well, I think your historical overview is critically important, particularly as you center the arguments that you just discussed and help the reader understand just how women's rights were an issue over a long span of the history. You know, the whole report in many ways is considered through the lens of women and security. Why is this so important to you as you put your thoughts forward? And, you know, I was very interested in what you wrote, in which you say that the international community's primary mistake was failing to achieve true inclusivity. Now, that's a powerful statement, and I know you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my country, Afghanistan, has always been seen, or mostly, from one main lens, and that is security. And then besides that comes the issue of women's rights. But they have rarely been effectively fused together. This has been a fatal mistake. And it may be even acknowledged that in the discourse that Afghan women are key to lasting peace, it's very apparent. But in reality, words and funding does not match the reality. So it has been a huge failure to incorporate women's rights truly into the security strategy, which has been the main lens from which Afghanistan has been seen. In addition, after all, security, economic development, and social development are very closely intertwined. We cannot have one without the other. So we need to be mindful of embeddedness of the question of women and security, and not just narrowly define women's empowerment as education and access to a limited fields of work and employment. It is much deeper and more holistic than that. In addition, this isn't just true in the context of Afghanistan. We have recently been witnessing that a very developed country with all the rights given to women and the development and trade in full-fledged, Germany has for the first time introduced their own national security strategy. And they have also recently have revamped their women, peace and security national action plan. The people that, interestingly, that are recognizing that is also the Taliban. It's because of that fact that more and more Afghan women are getting recruited to the madrasas to become radicalized and to become sort of complicit to their own oppression. Given this, I make a point to break down where the disconnects have historically occurred on the issue of women and security, as well as outline some of ideas of how women can truly be elevated to a national security agenda, a national development priority, not just a moral one. And the issue of inclusivity that you referred to, you cannot be inclusive if you ignore half of the population.
That's a very strong point, and an important one that is woven through your whole report. Now, during the 20-year intervention and after the fall of Kabul, the West has invested, as you said at the outset, heavily in Afghanistan, using many of its tools from diplomacy to international assistance. Tell us, because now we are in a different situation in Afghanistan, what did that investment make? What difference did it make? What didn't work? And what are the lessons we should learn from Afghanistan? I know that's a very profound question, but I think it's important to discuss.
Yes, like you point out, since the Taliban takeover, the international community has used all its tools or the traditional diplomacy tools to achieve its goals, from imposing sanctions to public condemnation of the regime and threatening to withdraw all the aid, holding negotiations with little result, I would say. And the reason that why they have not worked as effectively is very complex, but I am trying to discuss at least some of that in the report. But one big issue that it's not usually talked about is understanding the Taliban, not from a sympathetic point of view, I must be clear about that, but understanding how their ideology is the source of their rigor. They are not going to bend down and be sympathetic to women's rights when the very core of their regime, the main pillar of it, which is the very fundamentalist, conservative and draconian ideology, or the form of it that they are practicing, goes under question. So while I understand that there is the reluctance and wariness to engage with the Taliban, given Taliban's unwillingness to compromise on critical issues such as women's rights and and many other moral complexities that's attached to that. However, when the alternative is doing nothing, it's impossible to claim that this engagement is really taking the moral high ground, or even the path that most honors Afghan women. So, I mean, seizing all development initiatives certainly is not empowering women. It is further impoverishing them. With people's life in line, engagement really cannot be treated as an intellectual debate. Besides, there are many other ways to get women reintegrated in the society that are more nuanced and effective than current approaches. So my goal in that discussion is to bring some of those ideas in.
You make a very strong case for that, Ambassador Rahmani. And I wonder, there are many who say we spent billions and billions, even more dollars in Afghanistan, as did others in the international community. What was gained from that 20-year investment in light of what's happened today? What do you say to that question?
people do ask, and they clearly ask me sometimes, why should they care? Number one is they need more innovative approaches to ensure that the money that they are already allocating. I alluded initially very briefly that the US alone is spending over $2 billion in aid alone. To get more bang for their buck, basically, they need to have better strategies. And to do that, they need a better, more coherent strategy that is not only thinking about people in an arm length of giving them charity, but more of a policy that aid will give them also the leverage that they need to access the country better. Second, there is another growing concern about the restructuring of the regional geopolitics, moving away from the Western interest. Ultimately, the West has not just left a power vacuum behind, but it has given way to the countries that are not friendly to them. Countries like United States is losing their foothold in a large hostile region, which will have clear impact in terms of their global power relation as well as the national security, which needs attention. Furthermore, Afghanistan is immense. Afghanistan has immense natural resources and minerals that's becoming increasingly important as we are moving forward, especially with the revolutions of the green energy that it unfolds. And other countries have already moved on to Afghanistan. And last but not least, it's the issue of security. With a dozen groups of the terrorists operating in Afghanistan more freely than they did before. And we heard recently the commander of CENTCOM testifying that in 6 months, ISIS will be able to attack Western countries. I think it is more reason than before to have better than the over-horizon capacity in Afghanistan. So these are some of the reasons besides the moral or human compelling reasons because of the tragedies and the human suffering that's happening today to engage in Afghanistan.
Well, your report gives us a real understanding based on obviously what you just stated in terms of why we really need to stay engaged. The report also spends a good bit of its time on recommendations for the future, which I think is one of the most valuable aspects of the report because it's really looking forward and trying to make some understandings about what we could do today. Can you go into some of those recommendations? You mentioned the security sector, you mentioned education, better understanding the Taliban and what we do, the regional considerations. Give us a sense of what we should be doing, and you explained why we should engage, but how should we engage?
Yes. So first of all, I'm very intentional in trying to be practical while giving recommendations. We do understand that the high fly or bigger policies, overarching policies are immense important, and I'm giving very clear recommendations about that in terms of how it could be better coordinated, the security sectors, NATO allies, how they should come together, and what are some of the point of leverage that they can gain from that. But furthermore, I try to cover all levels of policymaking that need to improve. With that, for example, I go deep into the practical examples. You mentioned, for example, education. In that respect, I talk a lot about education, in fact, in the report, not just about the fact that we need to punish Taliban if they aren't allowing girls to go back to school, but other practical steps like funding international scholarships, subsidizing some of the existing architectures, institutions, private universities, that already exist. The infrastructure is there. Just to mobilize them or mobilize them, to use them as very effective tools to help this situation. We also don't actually need to wait for an agreement from the Taliban to send girls back to school. They are really using their precious time not being able to attend school. So one idea that I propose is providing tablets that are preloaded with the curriculum for specific to each grade. It could be negotiated, and these tablets could be long life batteries because of lack of electricity, being accessible to all the population. And then also it may not need internet connection for the girls to access the material, so that they do not necessarily lose the time that they have at this point, not being able to attend schools. In addition, and also let's not forget that both for girls and boys, when you have these wandering minds, the young ones eager and hungry for knowledge and information and connection, it can be swayed any other direction if they don't have access to real good education. Similarly, I provide examples of how technology can help prevent Afghanistan from becoming a black box. Connecting Afghan with the rest of the world in a variety of ways is totally essential. And last but not least, economic development and engagement is something that the report talks about from several angles. I truly think that the only way out of this mess is through economic development, including providing opportunities for private sector to go in and become engaged.
And given what is happening in Afghanistan today, given the horrific plight of women, do you see these avenues being open to pursue a number, as you call them, practical recommendations that you've listed for us?
I think this is an opening point, basically, because I'm trying to explore some of out of the box and new approaches to find a way. And this is basically in recognition that no country is going to put troops back on Afghanistan. And we are now in a new phase, and we definitely need new innovative approaches and access and influence. We need to find ways and means to engage in Afghanistan and take some really bold steps to the push to keep aid, for example, conditional on certain Taliban compromises is well-intentioned. I understand that. But ultimately, in my view, it's a misdirection of energy. Because knowing the Taliban, it may not work. We need to talk about truly transformative approaches. And some of it are going to be controversial and hard to swallow for myself too. Like maybe we start looking at reconsidering the UN classification of the Taliban. And I have to be clear. While we absolutely need to continue on the individual sanctions and all the travel ban that is there and give it more even rigor, but we need to advocate for expanding US Treasury licenses to increase the flow of funds to Afghanistan. This way, we would be reorienting the dependency from the people on the lifeline to that of the regime. This is going to give us the kind of access that we do not have, the leverage that we do not have. So while I understand that some of these suggestions might be shocking for some people to think about even, but when we get past the surface level, moralization of this and realize that what these policies could actually do for the Afghan people on the ground, we could see these potentials more clearly. And beyond that, we need to really look at Afghanistan more as a country versus a charity basket that it is now. Afghanistan has been continuously yo-yoing in this pendulum of a security threat or a charity basket, which this equation needs to be broken if we want stability there or long-term stability there. The Afghan population is the same people that they were before the takeover of the Taliban. They are freedom-loving people who largely fought for democracy, for progress during the past 20 years. So we cannot forget the incredible progresses that we have made together. We need to capitalize on that. That is still there. The international community cannot restore everything that was there once. But economic development and opportunities is a very effective way to empower the people to again gain the ability to make decisions for themselves. Because if our allies and partners who were involved in the past 20 years don't do it, others are doing it, and they're already stepping in.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Rahmani. I wish we had more time, but your report stands, and I recommend it to everyone because this just was an appetizer in some ways, and the whole banquet feast is before us in terms of the fullness of your report. It is the way forward that you are pursuing, but you also have the centrality of women as the way forward. And it can be found on the Atlantic Council website. It can also be found on the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security website. I hope that many will read it and consider some of the large numbers of recommendations you are making. May not always agree with them, but as you said, we need some new innovative thinking to understand how better to influence the situation and in every respect to help the people of Afghanistan. So thank you so much. And we are grateful for the time we've been able to spend together here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Verveer, for your time and non-stop support that you have given to Afghanistan, but particularly Afghan women and their plight and the fight for freedom and democracy. Thank you.